Just say I do to marriage of metal. If you're not familiar with what marriage of metal is, it is basically the inlay of one type of metal into another type of metal so that the inlaid metal is going completely through. And how this is typically done is one shape is sawn out and then traced onto the metal it will be inlaid into, and then that shape is also sawn out, and the pieces are precisely fit together and soldered in place and then finished as if they were one complete piece of metal. So here you see an amazing example that was made by Sarah Locktest, our technician here at the University of North Texas Metalsmithing and Jewelry program. And you can see the brass pieces inlaid into the copper pieces. If you were to flip this piece over, you would see that the brass goes completely through it. And if you look very closely, you can see the solder seam, and the solder seam should be at a very thin silver line that is in between the inlaid brass and the larger copper sheet. Now, the better that the marriage of metal is done, then the smaller the silver line or the seam should be. So let's get into how to do it. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to be showing two different methods that might initially appear to have very similar results, but there are some very important and subtle differences between them. So here you see two samples of a brass circle inlaid into a copper square. One was done by punching out both the brass disc as well as the hole through the copper sheet, and then the other was done by sawing, so sawing out the brass circle and then scribing that and then sawing out the opening into the copper sheet. And I'll be getting into those differences between those two approaches. Here you see the punched copper sheet and the punched brass disc, obviously from another piece of brass sheet. And hopefully what you can see here in this shot is that the punching process tends to just drag the metal with it a little bit, so you get a subtle radius on the top surface of the metal, and then when you flip it over, you can see a burr that is then present from that shearing action on the back side of the metal. Now, the burr can be removed, but since the metal has been deformed and pulled down, what that's going to do as we're going through the whole marriage of metal process is create kind of a bigger valley that the solder is going to sit down in, and it's ultimately going to require us to remove a lot more metal to get that seamless solder seam. So although it might initially be faster or seem very similar, there is a whole lot of extra work that's going to happen through this process because of taking this approach. So I have gently tapped the brass disc into the hole that was punched into the copper sheet, so they are snugly fitting together. And here, hopefully you can see a bit of that kind of valley that I was talking about with that radius that's present both on the punched brass disc and the copper disc. And I should emphasize that this is not an approach that I recommend taking for marriage of metal, but I did want to just compare what that whole process is with punching the metal as opposed to sawing all of your pieces out, which is what I strongly recommend doing for this whole process. So here you can see I am set up to solder those two pieces together. Since the marriage of metal component would be used in a larger piece and possibly soldered to again, although I don't personally recommend that, I would recommend doing hard solder just to be safe. Just for the purpose of these samples, I'm doing medium solder to just make the process go a little bit quicker. And I've used a fair amount, what I would consider a large amount of solder to try and fill that valley in between the brass and the copper as much as possible. So I'm just evenly heating the piece, and you should be able to see that solder flow soon. And then after that point, we'll be getting into all of the cleanup necessary. Here's just a quick shot of the front of the piece as soldered before pickling or any cleanup. And you can see the tendency of the solder, even though it was set down into that groove, to still flood across the metal and not necessarily sink down into that larger valley. And you do want to check on the back side to make sure that the solder has flowed fully through the seam and you have good fill and penetration of your solder seam before going any further. Now, I think one reason that more people don't do marriage of metal and that beginners aren't particularly fond of it is there is just a fair amount of cleanup usually necessary. And so there's really no shortcuts on this, and you just want to, I would recommend using a coarser file to remove the most amount of material, and then finishing up from there with finer files and finer and finer sandpapers, just to evenly smooth that whole surface of metal. And so what you want to do is reduce the thickness of metal as much as necessary so that all you're seeing is the solder seam between it. Here you can see the cleanup in process, and you can still see some of that valley from the dragged metal through the punching process. And this is really what I wanted to highlight here for the reason not to necessarily take this approach and to, from the beginning, just saw out the piece of metal, even if it's a punchable shape, just like a disc. So here it is in process, and then we're going to skip ahead to the finish. Now, I don't tend to take marriage of metal components to a higher polish because the sheen of the higher polish tends to obscure being able to see all of the work that went into putting the different colors of metal together. So this is still, you're seeing some kind of rougher finish on the surface of the metal. But the important thing to note here is the thin solder seam in between the brass and the copper. And although that is a relatively good approach, one thing I want to highlight is that it was necessary to remove a tremendous amount of extra material. And so I'm going to show a side view of the original thickness of the metals and then the finished blank. So here you can see an excellent illustration of why not to take the punched approach with marriage of metal. And so the piece of copper on the top is the original thickness of the sheet metal, and then the bottom piece is the finished blank of the marriage of metal using the punching technique. And so you can see almost half the thickness of the metal needed to be removed in order to get rid of that kind of valley or trough that was formed from the original punching. Now, you could try and file all that out, but then that is just going to enlarge the circle, and you're going to end up with a much wider solder seam, or it may even be too wide to solder at all. So this is just the important factor of why not to use the punching approach, and then I'll go back through this whole process just with sawing and illustrate what a better solution that is. So every stage in this process is really critical, and so the better job you can do at every stage, the better your final results will be. And so from the beginning, I would recommend using an accurate template and then a very fine-pointed sharpened scribe to get a very precise scribed line, and so that you can angle that scribe up against your template and get it as close to the exact dimension that you need it to be. In this case, a precise 1-inch circle. And again, every step in each of the processes needed for marriage of metal is really essential. And so as you're sawing, make sure that you're sawing exactly straight up and down. And also, this is something that sometimes beginners mix up, is you want to be sure which side of the line you're sawing on. So if this is the piece to be inlaid, this is the brass part that will be inlaid into the copper, I am sawing on the outside of the line. Now, if you're not working with a template or doing something like a circle like I am here, obviously you can saw out whatever shape that you need to. But then, again, you want to be keeping track of which side of the line you're going to be sawing on. And after sawing your piece out, regardless of the shape, and you're filing to clean up that sawn piece of metal, you want to be sure that you're filing perpendicular to the surface of the metal. So again, you're not going to be creating any larger trough or valley that the solder is going to have trouble filling and put you back into all of the issues that come with just punching the piece out. So you can just lightly deburr the metal, but really be sure that you are filing and keeping that cut edge or filed edge perpendicular to the larger surfaces of the metal. Now, when your piece of metal to be inlaid, in this case brass, is completely filed and the exact shape that you want to inlay into your base plate, in this case copper, then you can set it onto the piece of metal. I have just used a thin Sharpie and have a little registration point to make sure it's in the exact right orientation. This would be more important on other shapes that maybe aren't a perfect circle. And then I'm taking my fine pointed scribe, angling it so that as closely as possible I can scribe the line at the base point where the inlaid piece of metal is meeting the piece of metal that you're going to saw out. And from that, then I would drill, insert the saw blade, and pierce out on the inside of the line. So then I can hopefully just easily drop the inlaid piece of brass into the opening in the copper sheet. Here I'm now piercing out the opening that the inlay piece of metal is going to be inserted into. In this case, again, a circle. I've drilled the hole on the inside of the scribe line, and I'm sawing, making sure that my blade is perpendicular to the large surfaces of the metal, and sawing just on the inside of that line. And depending on the shape that you want to inlay, you can also file to correct any issues with the sawing, but you definitely don't want to go past that scribed line because that's going to create a larger gap between the inlaid metal and the base plate metal that might not be able to be filled with solder. And again, just as before, I'm filing to correct any slight issues with the sawing out so that you have exactly the opening that your inlay piece is going to fit into. I'm being careful to keep the file perpendicular to the main surface of the metal so that, again, I won't open up any kind of valleys or larger slopes that the solder is not going to be able to fill and end up similar to the issues that happened with the punched inlay. A great way to check how your inlay piece is fitting into the base plate metal is to insert it and then hold it up to a bright light so you can see what areas are tighter and what areas have a little bit more of an opening. For the purposes of this video, I did file out the opening just a little bit more, just so I would have a gap that is more common for what happens, particularly maybe the first time that you're trying marriage of metal, and so this would not be uncommon. And I'm going to show you a little tip that might be able to correct this if it's just a very, very slight gap. Now, ideally, you won't need this step. But oftentimes, especially if this is your first time doing marriage of metal, this might be necessary. And I would recommend starting with your inlay metal being at least one or a couple gauge thicker than the thickness of the metal to be inlaid into. So in this case, the brass inlay piece was 18 gauge and the base plate copper was 20 gauge. And so you can take a flat planishing hammer and lightly, this is again not, hopefully you can avoid this step, but if it's absolutely necessary to get your solder seam a little bit tighter, then you can lightly planish your brass piece of metal to get it to just spread ever so slightly to fill in that gap. So you can see here, after planishing lightly, we've been able to reduce the gap between the brass piece to be inlaid into the copper, although you can still see a little bit of light coming through, and we'll see that hopefully can just be filled with solder and might be just a slightly thicker band of solder in the finished piece. But we've definitely improved our chances of having a nice minimal silver line going all the way around the inlaid brass piece. Now I've set this up to solder just exactly the same as I did for the other sample. I'm using a little bit less solder because I don't anticipate needing to sort of fill as large of a gap. And again, just evenly heating the piece, fluxing the seam on both surfaces, the top surface that you see here, and then also the underside, just to keep everything nice and clean and to facilitate as the solder flows, making sure that it flows fully through the seam, visibly on the top, and then also on the back side as well. Now here's a close-up of the piece soldered in place, just as soldered before any pickling or cleanup or anything like that. And then also a view on the back side just to show that the solder is fully penetrating the seam from the top surface all the way down to the bottom. Now going through all of the same cleanup process, you can see the kind of rough sanded finish of this approach of the brass piece inlaid into the copper. And again, very, very fine, almost unnoticeable solder seam between the brass and the copper. And also an important thing to note about the differences in the thickness of metal. So if you remember from the punched process and how much thinner that finished piece of marriage of metal needed to end up being, as opposed to what you can see here, that there's not nearly as much metal that needed to be removed. It's a more efficient process. It's a little bit faster, but then also you're not losing as much of the metal and could cause other kinds of issues depending on what you want to do with the component of marriage of metal in a larger piece. So side by side and at first glance might see very similar results, but certainly as we've gone through the details and the full process of both the punching the approach versus the sawing, we're all now well aware of the differences and why you would want to choose sawing out your shape. And also, certainly sawing out shapes gives you a much greater design flexibility where you're not limited to what kind of shapes you might have punches for. So it might be common in a lot of metal studios to have disc punches and maybe even some other shapes, but certainly being able to properly approach this with sawing really gives you great design versatility and possibilities for incorporating it into your work. So I hope this has been useful and helps you do the best job possible with marriage of metal, and I would love to see what you create, so let me know. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.